The Luftwaffe ace circled the crippled American fighter, watching pieces of wing skin peel away in the slipstream. He'd counted his cannon strikes at least 40 direct hits. The P-47 should have been a fireball 3 minutes ago. Instead, it kept flying, kept turning, kept fighting back. In that moment, Hauptmann Klaus Heidelmann realized the German High Command had made a catastrophic miscalculation about American engineering and about what it would take to win the war in the skies over Europe. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The briefing room at Jagdgeschwader 26's airfield in Vitry-en-Artois, France, smelled of stale cigarette smoke and aviation fuel. Hauptmann Klaus Heidelmann stood before a wall-mounted intelligence photograph showing the profile of a stubby, barrel-shaped fighter aircraft. At 31, Heidelmann was already a veteran with 43 confirmed kills, most of them scored against RAF Spitfires and American P-38 Lightnings. His Iron Cross hung at his throat, and his eyes carried the particular weariness of men who'd seen too many friends fall from the sky. "This," he said, tapping the photograph with a wooden pointer, "is what the Americans are calling the P-47 Thunderbolt. Intelligence reports say they've begun arriving in England in significant numbers." The assembled pilots, 12 men ranging from teenagers with barely 20 flight hours to grizzled veterans, studied the image with professional interest. To their experienced eyes, the P-47 looked wrong. Its fuselage was too thick, almost grotesque. The cockpit sat far back on the airframe, and the whole aircraft appeared to be built around an engine that was far too large for sensible fighter design. Oberleutnant Werner Schroeder, a 24-year-old ace from Bavaria with 31 kills, let out a dismissive laugh. "It looks like someone strapped wings to a beer barrel and called it a fighter." The room erupted in chuckles. Even Heidelmann allowed himself a slight smile, though something in the intelligence brief troubled him. The specifications listed the P-47's weight at over 7 tons, fully loaded nearly double that of their Focke-Wulf 4 190 seconds. Its engine produced an astounding 2,000 horsepower at altitude. "Don't underestimate it based on appearance," Heidelmann cautioned, though his tone lacked conviction. "The Americans don't build anything without reason." Feldwebel Otto Becker, the squadron's oldest pilot at 36, squinted at the photograph. Becker had flown in Spain during the Civil War and in Poland at the war's beginning. His hands bore burn scars from a crash landing in 1940, and he flew with a calculated conservatism that had kept him alive longer than most. "What's its performance profile?" Heidelmann consulted his notes. "Maximum speed approximately 430 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. Service ceiling around 42,000 feet. Range with drop tanks over 800 miles. Speed and altitude," Becker mused, "but that weight, it can't possibly maneuver. One turn, and we'll be on its tail." This assessment aligned with everything the Luftwaffe pilots knew about fighter combat. Maneuverability had always been king. The legendary dogfights over the Channel, the swirling furballs above France, these battles went to the pilot who could outturn, outclimb, outthink his opponent in 3-dimensional space. Weight was the enemy of maneuverability. A 7-ton fighter was an absurdity, an engineering exercise that would prove disastrous in actual combat. Schroeder stood and approached the photograph, examining it more closely. 8 machine guns, yes? The Americans always overshoot their armament. More guns mean more weight, slower roll rate, worse climb performance. They never learn. "Actually," Heidelmann corrected, "some reports indicate they're carrying up to 8 50-caliber Browning machine guns, with 400 rounds per gun. That's 3,200 rounds of ammunition total." A low whistle echoed through the briefing room. Even by Luftwaffe standards, that was excessive firepower. The 4 190 carried 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns, devastating, but carefully balanced for performance. This American approach seemed to violate every principle of fighter design. "They've built a bomber-destroyer," Becker concluded. "Something to sit in formation and throw lead at our bombers. But in a turning fight? Against experienced pilots, it's a coffin. The assessment made sense. The Americans had lost hundreds of B-17 bombers to Luftwaffe attacks over the past year. Their P-38 Lightning and P-51 Mustang fighters were effective but couldn't be everywhere at once. The P-47, with its massive ammunition capacity and high-altitude capability, appeared to be a specialized tool, a flying gun platform designed to protect bomber formations, not to dogfight with the Luftwaffe's finest. Heidelmann dismissed the briefing with a reminder to maintain vigilance, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that the P-47 represented more of a nuisance than a threat. The real danger remained the Spitfire and the P-38, nimble fighters flown by increasingly skilled pilots. This new American creation seemed destined to join the long list of promising designs that failed in combat. He was wrong. They were all wrong. The morning of April 15th broke clear and cold over northern France. Heidelmann led a Swarm 4 aircraft flying in the flexible Finger 4 formation on a routine patrol along the coast. Intelligence had reported heavy bomber activity, and German radar stations tracked multiple formations heading toward industrial targets near Antwerp. Flying at 25,000 feet, Heidelmann scanned the brilliant blue sky, a habit so ingrained it required no conscious thought. The cold at this altitude seeped through his flight suit despite its heating elements. His breath fogged in the cockpit, and the Teflov WW's 190's engine thrummed with mechanical reliability. Then Schroeder's voice crackled over the radio. Heidelmann, bogies at 10 o'clock high, 6 aircraft, climbing. Heidelmann swiveled his head and spotted them immediately, 6 stubby fighters clawing for altitude, their distinctive shapes unmistakable even at distance. P-47 Thunderbolts. This would be the squadron's first engagement with the new American fighter. All aircraft, prepare for attack, Heidelmann ordered, his voice calm despite the spike of adrenaline. We'll use altitude advantage. Diving attack from the sun, then extend and climb. Standard tactics. The 4 German fighters repositioned, gaining another 2,000 feet of altitude and maneuvering to attack from the direction of the morning sun. This was textbook Luftwaffe doctrine: use altitude, use surprise, make one devastating pass, then escape before the enemy could react. The American formation seemed unaware of the threat above them. They maintained a loose combat spread, climbing steadily but without the urgency of pilots who knew they were being stalked. Now, Heidelmann commanded. 4 Fokker-Wulfs rolled inverted and dove, air screaming over their wings as they accelerated past 400 miles per hour. Heidelmann selected the rightmost P-47 as his target, centering the gunsight reticle just ahead of the American fighter's massive engine cowling. At this closure rate, he'd have perhaps 2 seconds to fire before overshooting. The range counter in his head clicked down 800 meters, 600, 400. At 300 meters, Heidelmann squeezed the trigger. His 420mm cannons erupted, sending a stream of explosive shells toward the P-47. He saw strikes flashes of light as shells detonated against metal walking across the American fighter's wing root and fuselage. A solid burst. Any other fighter would have shed a wing or erupted in flames. The P-47 shuddered, dropped a wing, then leveled out and continued flying. Heidelmann flashed past at over 450 miles per hour, too fast to observe more. He pulled back on the stick, using his speed to zoom climb back to altitude. Standard procedure: never dogfight at the enemy's altitude where numbers could overwhelm you. But something was wrong. Over the radio, Schroeder's excited voice. Hits on target. Good hits. But he's still flying. What is this aircraft made of? Heidelmann craned his neck, looking back and down. All 6 P-47 seconds remained airborne. One trailed a thin stream of coolant, but none were falling, none were burning. The German dive attack, a tactic that had destroyed hundreds of Allied fighters, had achieved nothing. Reform on me, Heidelmann ordered, trying to mask his confusion. We'll make another pass. But the P-47 seconds weren't running. Instead, they were turning into the attack, climbing aggressively despite their supposed weight penalty. Their rate of climb seemed impossible for such heavy aircraft. Becker's voice, tight with surprise. They're climbing with us. How are they climbing with us? The answer, which none of the German pilots yet understood, lay in the P-47's massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine and its turbo supercharger. At high altitude, where the U-190's performance began to fade, the Thunderbolt came into its own. That ridiculous weight, that oversized engine, it was all optimized for combat above 25,000 feet. Heidelmann rolled into another diving attack, this time targeting a P-47 that had separated slightly from its formation. He opened fire at 400 meters, walking his cannon shells across the American fighter's broad back. Multiple hits sparked along the fuselage. Pieces of metal, possibly access panels, blew away in the slipstream. The P-47 snap-rolled, dove 1,000 feet, then pulled back up into the fight. "Impossible," Heidelmann muttered. A 4-190 could not have survived that damage. A Bf-109 would have disintegrated. Even the rugged Soviet Yak fighters would have gone down. But this American machine absorbed punishment that should have been catastrophic and continued fighting. The engagement devolved into a swirling dogfight, something Heidelmann had wanted to avoid. The P-47 seconds proved less maneuverable than the FW-190 seconds, in tight turns, that much of the intelligence assessment was correct, but they compensated with aggressive tactics and mutual support. When Heidelmann positioned behind one Thunderbolt, another would immediately dive on him, forcing him to break off, and their firepower was devastating. Schroeder screamed over the radio, "I'm hit! I'm hit!" Heidelmann's head snapped around in time to see Schroeder's 4-190 stagger under the impact of multiple 50-caliber rounds. Smoke poured from the engine. More rounds stitched across the cockpit canopy. The Focke-Wulf snap-rolled inverted and began a flat spin, pieces of wing and tail section separating from the main fuselage. The engagement had lasted less than 4 minutes. Schroeder was dead or dying. The other 3 German fighters had burned through most of their ammunition, and all 6 P-47 seconds remained combat effective. "Break off," Heidelmann ordered. "All aircraft, break off and return to base." As the foe 190 seconds dove away toward France, Heidelmann looked back one final time. The P-47 seconds weren't pursuing, they'd accomplished their mission of protecting the bomber stream that now droned toward Antwerp unmolested. But that wasn't what stuck in Heidelmann's mind. What haunted him was the sight of the P-47 he'd hit in his first pass. It was forming back up with its squadron, trailing a bit of fluid, its fuselage pockmarked with cannon strikes, flying as if nothing had happened. Back at Vitry-en-Artois, the debriefing took place in stunned silence. Ground crews examined the 3 returning W-190 seconds and counted 14 50-caliber bullet holes across the aircraft. Schroeder's empty chair dominated the room like an accusation. "It should have gone down," Becker said quietly. He'd fired a full burst into a P-47 at point-blank range, close enough to see the American pilot's head in the cockpit. "I had him dead center. 4 cannons, 2 machine guns, solid hits from 200 meters. The fuel tanks should have exploded. The wing should have separated. Something should have failed." Heidelmann said nothing. He was reviewing the engagement in his mind, analyzing what had gone wrong. The tactics had been sound. The pilots had been experienced. The gunnery had been accurate. They'd done everything correctly according to Luftwaffe doctrine, and they'd lost. A young pilot named Lieutenant Hans Kruger, who'd been flying his 5th combat mission, spoke with the bluntness of inexperience. "What if we can't shoot them down? What if there's no way to destroy that aircraft with what we're carrying?" The room went silent. It was the question everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to voice. Heidelmann finally stood and walked to the intelligence photograph of the P-47 still pinned to the wall. He studied it with new eyes, seeing not an ungainly design but a purposeful one. Every aspect that had seemed like a flaw now revealed itself as intentional engineering. The thick fuselage, armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks, the heavy weight, redundant systems and structural reinforcement, the oversized engine, power to carry all that protection and still outclimb their fighters at altitude. "It's not designed to dogfight," Heidelmann said slowly, working through the realization. It's designed to survive, to absorb damage and keep fighting. The Americans looked at every fighter we shot down, studied every kill, and built an aircraft specifically to survive our tactics. Becker leaned forward. But we hit them, multiple times, cannon shells that would destroy any other aircraft. And they kept flying. Heidelman turned to face his pilots. Which means we need to change how we engage them. More ammunition on target, concentrated fire, sustained attacks, or we avoid them entirely and go after the bombers they're protecting. But even as he said it, Heidelman knew the equation had shifted. The P-47 represented something new in aerial warfare, not the fastest fighter, not the most maneuverable, but perhaps the most survivable. And, in a war of attrition, survivability might matter more than any other characteristic. The American strategy was becoming clear. They could afford to lose the occasional fighter. They had hundreds more being built in factories in Michigan and New York and Pennsylvania. But each Luftwaffe pilot took years to train, years of experience that couldn't be replaced. If the P-47 could survive long enough to protect the bombers, if it could trade unfavorably but still accomplish its mission, then the mathematics of air warfare shifted decisively in America's favor. Over the next 2 weeks, Heidelman's squadron engaged P-47 seconds 12 more times. They shot down 3, but only by concentrating the fire of multiple aircraft on single targets, and always at the cost of leaving themselves vulnerable to attack from other Thunderbolts. 7 more German pilots died or were wounded. The kill ratio that had once favored the Luftwaffe had evaporated. In late April, Heidelman received a combat report from another Jagdgeschwader based near Berlin. A P-47 had been engaged by 4 Bf 109 seconds. The German pilots had made multiple firing passes, documenting over 60 cannon strikes. The Thunderbolt's right engine had been hit except the P-47 only had one engine, Heidelman realized. The report meant the main engine. The cooling system had been shredded. The hydraulics had failed. Half the control surfaces were damaged. The P-47 had flown 180 miles back to England and landed safely. The report concluded with a sentence that Heidelman would remember for the rest of his life. No fighter aircraft should be capable of absorbing this level of battle damage and remaining controllable. Enemy engineering standards exceed previous assessments. It was the closest thing to an admission of defeat he'd ever seen in an official Luftwaffe document. By May 1943, the P-47 had become the dominant escort fighter over occupied Europe. American pilots, initially skeptical of their heavy and unorthodox mount, had learned to exploit its strengths. They fought in the vertical, using dive and zoom tactics that negated the Luftwaffe's turning advantage. They used their 8 machine guns to saturate areas with fire, knowing that even a few hits on a German fighter would be catastrophic. Most importantly, they survived. Heidelman studied after-action reports from across the front. P-47 seconds were returning to base with damage that should have been unsurvivable: wings shredded by cannon fire, tail sections nearly severed, engines with holes punched through cylinder banks. American ground crews photographed the damage, and intelligence photos made their way to Luftwaffe headquarters. The message was clear. Conventional tactics weren't working. In a June meeting with the Geschwader commander, Heidelman presented his analysis. The P-47 has changed the tactical situation. Our fighters were designed for short-range interception and air superiority missions over friendly territory. The Americans have designed a fighter for long-range escort and sustained combat over enemy territory. It prioritizes survivability over performance. We're trying to win dogfights. They're trying to protect bombers and get their pilots home alive. Those are different missions requiring different aircraft. The commander, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War named Oberst Hermann Ziegler, listened grimly. We need heavier armament. The Mk 108 30mm cannon instead of the 20mm. We need to hit them harder, because we can't hit them enough times with what we have. Or, Heidelman paused. Or we accept that we cannot consistently stop the escorts and focus entirely on destroying bombers before the Thunderbolts arrive. It was a bitter pill. For 3 years, Luftwaffe fighter pilots had dominated European skies. They'd been the hunters, the predators, the elite. Now they were being asked to avoid combat with enemy fighters and cherry-pick easier targets before running for safety. Ziegler stared at the intelligence photos spread across his desk, P-47 seconds, with battle damage that looked unsurvivable, all safely back at their English bases. Finally, he nodded. I'll forward your recommendations to Luftflotte 3 headquarters, but don't expect them to be well received. High Command still believes our fighters are superior. Our fighters are superior in some ways, Heidelmann said carefully. But the Americans aren't trying to build superior fighters. They're trying to win a war of attrition, and their aircraft are better suited to that mission than ours. The distinction would take months, years for the Luftwaffe High Command to fully accept. By then, it would be far too late to matter. That evening, Heidelmann stood outside the operations building, smoking a cigarette and watching the sun set over the French countryside. Somewhere over England, P-47 Thunderbolts were being loaded with ammunition and fuel for tomorrow's mission. American pilots, boys from Iowa and Texas and New York, most younger than his own pilots, were receiving briefings, checking equipment, writing letters home. And tomorrow, they would come again. They would absorb the fire of German cannons, lose a few fighters, and keep coming. Because unlike the Luftwaffe, the Americans had figured out that in modern warfare, survivability mattered more than elegance, more than speed, more than tradition. Heidelmann took a final drag on his cigarette and flicked it into the grass. The war was far from over, but he could see the shape of its ending now. It was written in the bullet-riddled hulls of American fighters that refused to fall from the sky. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content, like this. The heat of June 1943 settled over northern France like a suffocating blanket. Hauptmann Klaus Heidelmann stood in the shadow of his Fokker-Wulf's wing, watching mechanics install the new Mk108 30mm cannon that had finally arrived from the factory. The weapon was heavier than the 20mm cannons it replaced, and its lower muzzle velocity made long-range gunnery more difficult. But its shells carried 3 times the explosive power, enough, theoretically, to bring down a P-47 Thunderbolt with just a few solid hits. Theoretically, Feldwebel Otto Becker approached across the tarmac, his flight boots scuffing against the concrete. The older pilot had grown quieter in recent weeks, his movements more deliberate, as if he were calculating the odds before every action. He'd seen too many young pilots arrive full of enthusiasm, fly 3 missions, and disappear into the Channel or the French countryside. How many aircraft do we have operational? Heidelmann asked. 11, Becker replied. Down from 18 last month. We're getting replacement aircraft faster than we're getting replacement pilots. It was the fundamental problem facing the Jagdwaffe in the summer of 1943. Aircraft could be built in factories, but skilled fighter pilots required years of training and hundreds of hours of flight time. The Americans and British were systematically destroying that irreplaceable resource, and the P-47 Thunderbolt was proving to be their most effective tool. A runner arrived from headquarters with the morning's intelligence summary. Heidelmann scanned it quickly. Heavy bomber formations expected over Bremen and Wilhelmshaven, strong fighter escort, including P-47 seconds from the newly arrived 56th Fighter Group. Expected altitude, 26,000 to 30,000 feet. Expected strength, 60 to 80 escort fighters. The numbers were staggering. Just 6 months ago, bomber formations had arrived with perhaps 20 fighters as escorts, and those fighters had to turn back after, penetrating barely 100 miles into occupied territory. Now the Americans were fielding escort groups that outnumbered entire Luftwaffe Geschwaders, and they could range as far as the Netherlands before fuel constraints forced them home. What's the plan? Becker asked, reading over Heidelmann's shoulder. We hit the bombers before the escorts arrive in strength, Fast in, fast out. No prolonged engagement with the Thunderbolts. Heidelman folded the briefing document. And if we do encounter P-47 seconds, we use the new tactics vertical attacks only. No turning fights. Concentrate fire from multiple aircraft. The tactics had been developed through painful trial and error over the past 2 months. The Luftwaffe had learned that trying to dogfight with P-47 seconds at high altitude was suicidal. The American fighters could dive faster than the TEMW 190 seconds could pursue, and their pilots had been trained to never, under any circumstances, get dragged into a low-altitude turning fight where the German fighters held the advantage. Instead, Heidelman's squadron had adopted a strategy of boom and zoom attacks from extreme altitude, diving through the bomber formations, firing at point-blank range, then using their speed to climb back to safety before the escorts could intercept. It was effective but exhausting, and it required split-second timing. Any pilot who misjudged his dive angle or stayed in the attack too long would find himself swarmed by angry Thunderbolts. The morning mission briefing drew 22 pilots, 11 from Heidelman's squadron and 11 from a sister unit based 15 kilometers away. They were a mixed group, hardened veterans with over 100 combat missions alongside teenagers who'd graduated from flight school just weeks ago. The experienced pilots wore their uniforms with casual disregard, leather jackets stained with oil and sweat. The new pilots sat rigid in their seats, their uniforms still crisp, their faces betraying the fear they tried so hard to conceal. Heidelman stood before a large map of northern Germany and the Netherlands. Red pins marked the expected bomber routes. Blue pins showed Luftwaffe airfields. He used a wooden pointer to trace the intercept plan. We'll form up over Oldenburg at 32,000 feet. First, Staffel will attack from 12 o'clock high, diving through the lead box of bombers. Second and third Staffel will attack from 9 o'clock, targeting the middle formations. Our objective is to down 5 bombers in the first pass, then extend west and climb for a second attack before the main escort arrives. A young pilot named Lieutenant Friedrich Weber raised his hand. He was 19 years old, blonde, with the kind of innocent face that made Heidelman's chest ache. Weber had arrived at the airfield 3 days ago, with exactly 53 hours of flight time in operational aircraft. Herr Hauptmann, what do we do if we encounter P-47 seconds during the attack? You break off immediately and dive away, Heidelman said firmly. Do not attempt to engage. Do not try to finish your attack run. You dive, extend to maximum speed, and egress the combat area. The P-47 seconds are faster than you in a dive, but if you have sufficient altitude and speed advantage, you can outrun them to the deck. Is that clear? Weber nodded, but Heidelman could see the confusion in his eyes. The young pilot had been taught that German fighters were superior, that aggressive tactics and fighting spirit would carry the day. Now he was being told to run from American fighters, to avoid combat, to strike and flee like a coward. But Heidelman had seen what happened to pilots who tried to fight P-47 seconds on even terms. Their names were now carved on stone memorials, or forgotten in unmarked graves scattered across France and Germany. The formation of 22 Fokker-Wulfs climbed through scattered clouds, their engines straining in the thin air above 30,000 feet. At this altitude, the cold was brutal, seeping through every gap in flight suits and gloves. Heidelman's breath formed ice crystals on the inside of his canopy, and he had to constantly wipe it clear with his gloved hand. Below and to the east, he spotted them a massive formation of B-17 flying fortresses, their contrails drawing white lines across the blue sky. He counted at least 60 bombers arranged in tight defensive boxes, each aircraft bristling with 50 caliber machine guns. Supporting them, scattered in a protective screen, were the telltale stubby shapes of P-47 Thunderbolts. All aircraft, target acquired, Heidelman radioed. First Staffel, prepare for attack run. Watch for escorts at our altitude. He rolled his FOL 190 inverted and pulled the nose down, feeling the immediate surge of acceleration as gravity added to engine power. The airspeed indicator climbed rapidly 400 kilometers per hour, 500, 600. The wind noise rose to a howl. His vision narrowed as G-forces pulled blood from his head. The bomber formation swelled in his windscreen. At this closing speed, he had perhaps 5 seconds to line up a shot, fire, and pull away before overshooting or colliding with the American formation. He selected a B-17 inches the lead element, centering his gun sight on the distinctive glass nose where the bombardier sat. At 800 meters, tracers reached up toward him from the bomber's defensive guns, bright orange streaks that seemed to float lazily before accelerating past his canopy. At 400 meters, he squeezed the trigger. The new Mk-108 cannon had a distinctive low-frequency thump, quite different from the sharper crack of the 20mm weapons. He saw strikes explosions of metal and glass walking across the B-17's nose and right wing. The bomber's No. 3 engine erupted in flames. Pieces of cowling spun away into the slipstream. Heidelman pulled hard on the stick, the G-forces crushing him into his seat as the Tupolev U-190 arced away from the formation. Tracer fire followed him, but he was already out of effective range. "First, Staffel, break left and climb," he ordered, scanning the sky for threats. That's when he saw them. 4 P-47 seconds, diving from 35,000 feet with the sun behind them. They'd been there the entire time, waiting at extreme altitude for the German fighters to commit to their attack. Now they were coming down like avenging angels, their 8 machine guns already sparkling with muzzle flashes. Break, break, escorts diving from 6 o'clock high. The disciplined formation dissolved into individual fights for survival. Heidelman snap-rolled right and dove, pushing his 4-190's nose down to gain maximum speed. The G-forces reversed, and he felt himself rising against his seat straps as the negative Gs took hold. Behind him, a P-47 followed, its pilot expertly matching Heidelman's maneuvers. The American was good, very good. He maintained position about 400 meters back, not rushing the shot, waiting for Heidelman to make a mistake or run out of altitude. Heidelman's altimeter unwound rapidly 28,000 feet, 25,000, 22,000. His airspeed reached 750 kilometers per hour, faster than he'd ever flown the TEB-190. The aircraft began to buffet, the controls growing stiff as aerodynamic loads built up. Any moment now, the American would have to pull out of the dive or risk compressibility effects that would lock up his controls. But the P-47 stayed with him. 19,000 feet, 16,000 feet. The ground was rushing up now, the patchwork of French farmland resolving into individual fields and hedgerows. Heidelman's hands were locked on the control column, fighting the forces trying to push the stick forward. At 12,000 feet, tracers streamed past his canopy. The American had finally opened fire, calculating that even a lucky hit would be better than breaking off. Heidelman could hear the impact's sharp metallic cracks as 50 caliber bullets punched through the thin aluminum skin of his tail section, 8,000 feet. He couldn't stay in the dive much longer. Heidelman hauled back on the stick, with both hands. The G-forces slammed into him like a physical blow. 5 Gs, 6, 7. His vision greyed at the edges, his peripheral vision disappearing into a dark tunnel. Blood vessels in his eyes burst from the pressure. The FUF-190 groaned as its airframe absorbed stresses it was never designed to endure. But it pulled out of the dive. Heidelman leveled off at 3,000 feet, gasping for breath, his vision slowly clearing. He looked back and up, searching for the P-47, there 4,000 feet above him, climbing away to rejoin the bomber formation. The American pilot had broken off the pursuit, correctly judging that following Heidelman down to the deck would leave him vulnerable and far from his assigned bombers. The engagement had lasted less than 90 seconds, but Heidelman felt as if he'd aged years. His hands were shaking on the controls. The back of his flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the cold, and somewhere over Germany, the battle was still raging. Of the 22 German fighters that had launched that morning, 17 returned to base. 3 had been shot down by P-47 seconds. 1 had collided with a B-17 during an attack run, killing both the German pilot and the American bomber crew. 1 had been so badly damaged by defensive fire that the pilot had bailed out over occupied territory. They had destroyed 4 B-17 bombers confirmed, with 2 more listed as probable kills, 4 bombers for 5 fighters. The mathematics of attrition had turned decisively against the Luftwaffe. Heidelmann sat in the debriefing room, listening to his pilots describe their encounters. The stories had a familiar pattern: successful attacks on the bombers, followed by sudden intervention by P-47 seconds that appeared to materialize from nowhere, then desperate dives to escape, with the American fighters pursuing far longer than seemed possible. Becker had put 14 30mm shells into a P-47 during a head-on pass. The American fighter had been visibly damaged, he'd seen pieces blow off the engine, cowling and wing roots, but it had remained airborne and continued fighting. 14 hits, Becker repeated, as if saying it again would make it make sense. With 30mm high-explosive shells, 14 hits. Lieutenant Weber hadn't returned. His wingman reported seeing Weber's 4-190 take fire from multiple P-47 seconds during the initial engagement. The aircraft had entered a flat spin and crashed into a forest south of Bremen. Whether Weber had been killed by the gunfire or had simply lost control didn't matter. He was dead at 19, with exactly 4 combat missions to his name. Heidelmann drafted his after-action report with a growing sense of futility. The same patterns emerged from every engagement. German fighters could penetrate to the bombers, could score hits, could occasionally down a B-17 or B-24, but the price kept escalating, and the P-47 seconds were becoming more numerous and their pilots more skilled with each passing week. In early July, Heidelmann was summoned to Paris for a conference with senior Luftwaffe commanders. He travelled by staff car through countryside that showed increasing signs of Allied air superiority, bomb craters near railway junctions, burned-out vehicles beside roads, civilians who no longer looked up when aircraft passed overhead because they'd learned to recognize the sound of American engines. The conference room in the commandeered French hotel was filled with officers, most of them staff personnel who hadn't flown combat missions in months or years. They studied maps and charts, discussed fighter production numbers and pilot training pipelines, debated the relative merits of various tactical doctrines. Heidelmann stood when called upon and delivered his assessment. The P-47 Thunderbolt has fundamentally altered the strategic situation over occupied Europe. Our fighters can no longer operate with the freedom of action we enjoyed in 1940 or 1941. The Americans have achieved local air superiority during daylight hours over an expanding area of northern France, the Low Countries, and western Germany. Their strategy is not to win dogfights, but to protect their bombers and attrit our fighter force through sustained combat. They are succeeding. A general lieutenant from the Air Ministry's technical branch objected. Our intelligence indicates the 4-190 and Bf-109 remain superior in maneuverability and climb rate. If our pilots are trained to exploit these advantages— Our pilots are dying, Heidelmann interrupted, a breach of protocol that drew sharp looks from around the table, not because they lack training or courage, but because they're flying aircraft designed for a different kind of war. The P-47 is not trying to outturn us or outclimb us. It's trying to absorb our fire, protect its bombers, and kill enough of our pilots that we can no longer mount effective resistance. It's succeeding because it was purpose-built for that mission. The room fell silent. Finally, an Oberst from Luftwaffe 3 operations spoke. What would you recommend? Heidelmann had been thinking about this question for weeks. We need fighters with heavier armament. The Me-262 jet program should be accelerated. We need to stop trying to escort our bombers and focus entirely on homeland defense. And most critically, we need to husband our experienced pilots instead of throwing them into unwinnable engagements day after day. But he knew, even as he said it, that none of these recommendations would be implemented in time to matter. The Reich was already on the defensive, already losing the war of attrition. The P-47 Thunderbolts were just one symptom of a larger problem. American industrial capacity was overwhelming German military skill. By September, the strategic situation had deteriorated beyond recognition. American daylight bombing raids now penetrated deep into Germany, sometimes reaching Berlin itself. The P-47 seconds had been joined by P-51 Mustangs with even longer range. German fighter losses had reached unsustainable levels, over 1,000 aircraft per month, with pilot casualties even more devastating. Heidelmann's squadron had been rotated back from France to defend the homeland, now based at an airfield outside Magdeburg. Of the original pilots who'd flown with him in March, only Becker remained. The rest were dead, missing, or so badly wounded they'd never fly again. Replacement pilots arrived, weekly boys with barely 50 hours in type, thrust into combat against American pilots who'd refined their tactics through months of sustained operations. On September 27th, Heidelmann flew his final mission against P-47 Thunderbolts. The engagement took place over Hanover during a massive American raid targeting ball-bearing factories. Heidelmann led 190 seconds against a formation of 40 B-17 seconds, escorted by at least 60 P-47 seconds. The numerical disadvantage was so overwhelming that the mission briefing had explicitly stated, "Hit the bombers once and break off immediately." Heidelmann made his attack run from 32,000 feet, diving through the defensive fire, his 30mm cannons hammering at a B-17 inches, the trailing element. He saw strikes, saw an engine begin to stream fire, then pulled away into a climbing turn. 3 P-47 seconds were waiting. They must have seen him setting up for the attack, must have climbed above him and positioned themselves perfectly. As Heidelmann began his zoom climb, expecting to regain altitude safely, the Thunderbolts dove from above and behind, their combined firepower 24 machine guns converging on his aircraft. The first burst hit his right wing, punching through the aileron and tearing away a section of wing skin. The W-190 snap-rolled violently to the right. Heidelmann fought the controls, trying to regain level flight, but the damaged wing had disrupted his aircraft's aerodynamics. More rounds hammered into the fuselage, some of them slamming into the armor plate behind his seat with impacts he could feel, through his spine. The engine began to run rough, hit in the cooling system perhaps, or with damage to one of the cylinders. Heidelmann pushed the nose down into a dive, heading for the deck, but he knew this time would be different. The vibration in the controls told him the wing damage was severe. The engine was losing power, white smoke streaming from the cowling. He might make it to 10,000 feet. He might make it to 5,000, but he wouldn't make it home. At 8,000 feet, with the P-47 seconds still pursuing, Heidelmann made his decision. He rolled the crippled FW-190 inverted, jettisoned the canopy, and released his seat straps. The slipstream caught him and tore him from the cockpit. He tumbled through the air, completely disoriented, unable to tell up from down. At 5,000 feet, he pulled his ripcord. The parachute deployed with a violent jerk that knocked the wind from his lungs. Suddenly, the world was quiet except for the distant rumble of engines and the crack of anti-aircraft fire. Heidelmann looked up to check his canopy fully deployed. No tears, then looked down to assess his landing zone. He was descending toward a small German village, smoke rising from a nearby factory that had been hit in the raid. As he drifted lower, civilians emerged from their homes and shelters, looking up at him. Some waved. Others just watched silently as another Luftwaffe pilot came down in defeat. Heidelmann landed hard in a field outside the village, his ankle twisting painfully as he hit the ground and rolled. Local Home Guard soldiers reached him within minutes, helping him out of his parachute harness, offering water and cigarettes. They were respectful but somber. They'd seen this scene too many times. From the field, Heidelmann watched the contrails of the American bomber stream heading east, the P-47 seconds still circling protectively above. One of the Home Guard soldiers followed his gaze. "Will we win, Herr Hauptmann?" the soldier asked. He was perhaps 50 years old, too old, for frontline service, wearing a uniform that didn't quite fit. Heidelmann thought about the question. He thought about Schroeder and Weber and all the other pilots who died trying to stop the American bombers. He thought about the P-47 Thunderbolts that absorbed impossible amounts of damage and kept flying. He thought about the mathematics of attrition that no amount of German courage or skill could overcome. "No," he said quietly. "We won't." Klaus Heidelmann survived the war, After his parachute landing, he spent 6 weeks recovering from his ankle injury, then was assigned to training duties, teaching new pilots tactics that he knew wouldn't save them. When the war ended in May 1945, he was arrested by American forces, interrogated about his combat service, then released after 3 months, when investigators determined he'd committed no war crimes. In 1947, Heidelman was interviewed by American military historians studying the air war over Europe. They showed him photographs of P-47 Thunderbolts that had returned to base with catastrophic damage, wings nearly severed, fuselages riddled with hundreds of holes, engines with cylinders blown apart. Each photograph was marked with a notation. Aircraft returned to service after repairs. We threw everything we had at them, Heidelman told the historians. Cannon fire, rocket attacks, aerial ramming in desperate cases, and they kept coming. Your engineers had solved a problem we didn't even know existed: how to build a fighter that could survive concentrated fire from multiple attackers and still complete its mission. One of the historians, himself a former P-47 pilot, asked, "When did you realize you couldn't win?" Heidelman thought back to that April morning in 1943, watching his first damaged P-47 limp away trailing smoke, still flying when it should have been falling. "The first time I engaged them," he said, "I just didn't want to admit it." The interview transcript ended with a technical assessment that Heidelman provided at the historian's request. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not the best fighter aircraft of the war by traditional measures. It was not the fastest, not the most maneuverable, not the most elegant, but it was the most survivable, and in a war of attrition, that proved to be the only characteristic that mattered. The Americans understood something we didn't, that in modern warfare, the aircraft that brings its pilot home alive is worth more than the aircraft that wins the dogfight but gets shot down the next day. Republic Aviation, the company that built the P-47, produced 15,686 Thunderbolts during the war. Of those, 3,499 were lost in combat, a loss rate of roughly 23%. By contrast, the Luftwaffe lost over 65% of its fighter force during the same period. The disparity wasn't due to superior American pilots or tactics, though both were excellent. It was due to engineering, to the unglamorous work of designers who added armor plate and self-sealing fuel tanks and redundant systems, who built an aircraft that could absorb 2,000 rounds of ammunition and still bring its pilot home. In 1967, Heidelman attended an air show in Munich where a restored P-47 Thunderbolt was on display. He spent 20 minutes walking around the aircraft, examining its construction, running his hand along the riveted metal skin. A young German reporter asked him what he was thinking. "I'm thinking," Heidelman said, "that this ugly machine killed more of my friends than any other Allied aircraft. And I'm thinking that it represents the moment when air warfare changed forever, when survival became more important than speed, when engineering triumphed over tradition, when we learned that sometimes the winner isn't the one who fights best, but the one who's still standing when the fight is over." The reporter asked if he felt bitter about losing to such an aircraft. Heidelman shook his head. "No. I feel grateful that I survived to see it. Most of my comrades didn't." He died in 1989, at the age of 77, having outlived the vast majority of pilots who flew fighters on either side during the Second World War. In his later years, he maintained correspondence with several former P-47 pilots, comparing experiences and reminiscing about a war that had tested them all to their limits. One of these correspondents, a retired American colonel named Robert Walsh, wrote in a letter dated 1985, "We always respected you guys. You were brave, skilled, and fighting for your country, but our aircraft gave us an edge you couldn't overcome. The P-47 wasn't a better fighter because it was faster or more maneuverable. It was a better fighter because it brought me home 58 times, even when by all rights I should have died." Heidelman kept that letter in his desk drawer, along with photographs of his old squadron and a piece of aluminum from his last TEBW-190A fragment recovered from the crash site years later. They were reminders of a time when he'd been young and certain, before he'd learned that certainty was a luxury no warrior could afford. The lesson of the P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't about superior engineering or American industrial might, though both played their part. The lesson was simpler and more profound. In war, as in life, survival is victory. Everything else is just details. And sometimes, survival requires building an aircraft that can take 2,000 rounds of punishment and still fly home. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.